All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening for the September 30th meeting of the Watershed Erosion Task Force. How about we do a roll call?
Member Bartlesmeyer, Member Delonte, Member Oakes,
Here.
Member Sturman,
Here.
Member Berger, excuse me, Member Patton, Member Share is on Zoom, Member Donaldson, Councilmember Edens,
Here.
and Chair Farmer.
Here. All right. I don't have too much to say this evening other than thanks everybody for joining us. We've got a couple guests here and a few folks in the room. So I won't take up too much of your time by saying anything too fancy. So with that, how about we do an approval for the minutes from the meeting all the way back in May? Anybody care to make a motion to approve those minutes? Miss Edens makes the motion. Anybody care to second it? Mr. Sturman will second it. All those in favor of approving the minutes for our May meeting, please say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? And anyone abstain? All righty, we have one abstention. And with that, it passes. All right, with that, we'll move on to our public comment. Joe, do we have any public speakers or Travis?
Yep, Mr. Chair, we have a few. I have Miss Meyer and Miss Adderman on the same card.
Okay. Ladies, if you'll join us, just so everybody, those watching at home and here in the room, just keep in mind, we try to keep things to about 5 minutes. This is a good thing for you guys to come talk to us. We appreciate it. Generally speaking, it's your time to talk. And if we can, we'll try to answer back. We don't always do that, but take it away.
We're just residents of 631 Creek Road, and we've had trouble for years with flooding. And it's a particular kind of our home. It's, it doesn't flood on the south side or north side, it floods up. So every time we get a bad storm, even a little storm, our tributary in the back of the yard goes bank full. We've tried every which way we know of to try to fix the water coming through there, and it's not going to, it's just coming up and over. The big creek now has gravel bars where it's just so full of gravel, so high, and debrided trees that have just come down the creek when they fall off the bank. They've come down the creek and they're now in this middle of our property in the creek, but they're just huge. And now the gravel is backing up. So every time now we're getting rain, it's coming up and over Fox Creek, the big Fox Creek, and onto our property. We put floodgates up on our patio doors, on our garage doors, every time it rains. We don't sleep at night because we're worried about, it's going to come up in the house. It came up in the house once. We lost everything we had in the lower den in the garage. So we're really cautious on that. But we just need your help. Back in, it was July, I notified the city and I said, we're still having trouble. Is there anybody that could help us? And Amy, I was talking to Amy and she got back with me, and, she didn't know the problem, but she said, you just get a chainsaw and you can fix that. Well, this is way past the chainsaw fix. So then I got a hold of Mike Walsh. He came out to the home and he was great. I mean, God bless him. He went ahead and come out and walked the property and everything with us. And he said, this is a huge problem here. And he said, I see it. So what he did with his help, we got our pictures sent to him. He did this for you all. And so we'd like to leave this with you all to look at and see if there's any kind of a solution where we can get some of that big clump of debris in the big creek. Because every time it rains now, when things go down, we're just getting bigger and more trees getting hung up.
Water comes our way to our property. And over the last 20 years, I can't tell you how much property
We've lost.
And and each year it just gets worse.
I mean, the neighbors have been great around us. Every time it rains, they're running over trying to help us put stuff up and put the floodgates up. Well, I'm getting too old to do this every time it rains. It's not practical. And we've cleaned as much as we can. I mean, if anybody knows our property, I think Joe does. He's been there before years ago, but I think, we take our pride in our property and we maintain everything. So we just can't keep up with the trouble. So we need your help. So whatever you guys can do to get something together for us that we'd feel better. And we've waited for 5 years now thinking maybe there was a solution. I know everything's going to Fox Creek, but we really need to, get on Fox Creek too. So thank you for your time. We really appreciate that. Julie, do you have anything?
Yeah, thank you. We're getting to the age where when it rains or it thunders and we're getting up in the middle of the night and fretting over, hey, you're going to flood. It's been 20 years. We put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears
And money.
into this property, trying to keep it up, you know, taxpayers just like a lot of other people. And it's scary to think every time it rains, we have to get up in the middle of the night and worry, are we going to flood?
So
So
thank you for
if
your time.
Whatever you guys
You're
could
gonna
do
give
for
me
us,
some
we would appreciate it.
Sure.
And
And if we can be of
it's-
any assistance,
Yeah.
call, and they've got my number, call me, come by, see Julie, see me, see anybody, but we'll be glad to work with any of you.
And Rob,
He's been there.
he has
He
seen our,
knows.
he has
He
seen
knows
our
too.
property.
I have a feeling he might have something to say about this here in just a moment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Yeah, our arborist who they're referring to, Mike, he does a great job. So we're gonna. Right. All right. Well, we're looking forward to seeing it. Thank you. All right. Mr. Rambo, you know the drill.
Intimidating me being out here in the audience. Yeah, these good folks are the example that I used to typically use for the suffering that happens in Fox Creek when I was on the committee, and I finally resigned more or less because I thought I would be dead before we get around to doing anything with Fox Creek. But there are things that we can do that I'm going to suggest. My goal is to get a couple of my comments as or topics as actual agenda items so that they get tracked and maybe there's some action. The first one is the landscape guide that's under construction right now. One component of that ought to be, and it can be a couple of pages. The less verbiage is probably better to some extent, and it should describe what landowners can and should do to correct what they see as existing problems in their whatever part of the watershed they're responsible for. The example that I'll use is there are some folks south of me that dumped in riprap against my direct advice, and now the eddy current downstream of that riprap has eaten away from the bank, and the road, an actual paved road, is ready to collapse. So they're ready to dump more riprap in. There's a better way to do that. Had they considered proper angle of repose and some vegetation, they probably wouldn't be in the fix they're in now. And so there are people out there that are doing the good old boy farmer fixes that don't work in this new rainfall regime. And if we could give them the appropriate information, just block diagrammatic form, I think it would really help out. And now's the time to do it. And so the agenda item number one is get this information in our plantings guide or whatever the appropriate place is for that. I think it would do a lot of good. And the other thing is, this is a brainstorm that I had because I probably have a mile of wildwood watershed, mostly Deer Creek that feeds to Fox Creek, tributaries of that. And some of it's rather wide. Over the years that I've been managing it, the places where I was able to lay the bank down, get some vegetation established, real cost effectively, it no longer erodes in the gully washers that we get. It just kind of lays the vegetation over like it's supposed to, and on goes the water. Downstream, though, off my property, there are typically a root wad or two or three, as they described, laying over in the stream bed. It's fine most of the time, but when we get one of these gully washers, it backs things up, things hang up in it, it creates a dam, and then the water backs up. And I have several acres of a very shallow lake. And these folks have seen photos of it. I know Joe has. And so my fix has been walk down there a couple times a year with a chainsaw, slice it up into firewood sized chunks, and it washes away. and it's made a remarkable difference in the upstream effects on my land and beyond my land when we have one of these gully washers. And so what I'm suggesting is, I think we should have some sort of a citizens watershed committee that walks these watersheds on a periodic basis. We can either pick a couple of days, one in the spring and one in the fall, where everybody does it, or we can do it just on an ad hoc basis and cover some of these stream areas. And if the person that's volunteering to do the surveying doesn't have a chainsaw, they can notify the city and we can get Public Works to go out there and do it, which they have done at my behest in the past. And so it really seems like a easy fix that will make a material difference in the flow of the creeks. And I've proven it to myself to my own satisfaction. So the second agenda item is for you folks to discuss that program. The key will be, is it legal to do so? Because when we did the stream survey, I had a lanyard around my neck that had my name on it, and it said Watershed Erosion Task Force survey, and probably some of you guys participated in as well. I walked from my property, which is the headwaters, all the way down to the Merrimack on Fox Creek Watershed. That's when I met these folks. And so I know it's doable. And maybe there's some additional liability concerns that pop up if we're doing it on a routine basis. But I really think a citizens committee of folks that will survey the watershed, it could really help us out and get rid of the logs. And if we notice some other problem, hey, this bank has receded 6 feet since the last time I was here, flag that too. So I think it's a powerful model. I'm not doing it justice, but that's what you guys are for. So anyway, that's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else? All right. Thank you for our speakers here this evening. I think Councilmember Rainbow and I have spoken a lot about this idea. I think it's a good one. So I think we need to get it, and we'll put it on our next agenda so we can kind of get it figured out, as we've dealt with a lot of things. There are some legal questions as to what we can do and who is technically responsible, which changes things a bunch, but we're working to get all that stuff figured out. So thank you guys for coming out. We appreciate it. And we're going to try to see what we can get done here. Hopefully we can get some things done. We're getting a lot of good information tonight, and we're getting a lot of good information moving forward with our stormwater master plan, which will hopefully be able to address a lot of these things and help us in a much bigger way. So with that, we can close public comment and move to the presentation of the final report from the USGS. Mr. Vunich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair and members of the task force, I'm proud to announce that we have the final report from the United States Geological Survey, a report that took approximately 2 years to develop, and then ultimately through review and peer review is now in final form for consideration by the city. We are fortunate tonight to have the study leader in attendance, Dr. Leroy, and she is going to give a brief overview of the study and some of its highlights. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Leroy with the chair's permission.
Absolutely.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, I will share my screen. Hopefully that will work.
Looks like it's working.
Okay, great. So first of all, I just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity to work on this study and for the opportunity to present tonight. I am going to give you just a brief overview of what's in the final report and take any questions that you might have. So I've got, this was very much a team effort. We've got a few different co-authors on the report who I'd just like to acknowledge before moving forward. David Hyman, Tyler Burke, Charlie Segrand, and Kyle Hicks. So just real quick, for those of you who have not had a chance yet to access the report, I've provided these links to the report as well as the associated data releases. This link at the top here will bring you to this page. You can download the report by clicking on this icon here, or by clicking on any of the links here for a PDF, or to basically a web version if you click HTML. And then the data releases are also linked there. So the scope of our report is a 3-part report. First part of the report covers our observations of geomorphic change in Cox Creek. So this includes an analysis of aerial photographs from 1990 to 2015 to get some long-term average rates of erosion and widening in the channel. We also then, in this section, have the results from our 4 terrestrial LiDAR surveys over the course of the 2-year study, as well as the bank erosion pin measurements. The second part of the report covers our hydrologic and hydraulic modeling, where we looked at the response of Cox Creek to design storms under current climate, as well as the effects of climate change and the effects of some hypothetical added storage in the basin. And then finally, part 3 covers our bank stability modeling, so simulations of bank retreat at a few key sites. And we are focusing in on, if you can see the red outlines, those were our 6 study reaches, as many of you know. So that's where those 6 red outlined areas are where we did our terrestrial LiDAR surveys, and kind of this whole main reach is where we focused our analysis of the model results. And this is just a quick look at the study period, so the 2 years that we were doing this erosion monitoring. I just want to point out, so this plot here is showing the annual peak stream flow at the gauge in Chesterfield. And so these are the 2 annual peaks from the years of the study. So I just wanted to point out they were not crazy high compared to what we've seen historically. In fact, the 2023 was on the low side compared to the historical record. Okay, so again, I'm just going to run through some of our takeaway points from each of these sections, but if there's any part that you'd like me to go into more detail, please feel free to ask questions. So with our long-term bank retreat measurements from aerial photographs, we found that between 1990 and 2015, the rates of bank retreat along the bends in those study reaches ranged from about 1/2 foot to 4.5 feet per year. And as we might expect, the bank retreat and widening occurred fastest on the outer banks of meander bends, as well as unforested banks, though we did also see erosion along forested banks. So even though we saw rapid erosion on unforested banks, the forested banks still also eroded. We did see that there were some locations where riprap had been placed and resulted in relatively stable banks at the location of the placement. But the presence of the riprap in the channel shows that it has been mobilized in the past. And then sort of the flip side of that coin, which one of your speakers before just mentioned, when we have riprap placed either in small piles or not aligned with the bank, those are locations where the riprap might have actually exacerbated erosion around the surrounding bank. And then finally, in one of our study reaches, study reach 3, that was a location where we were really more interested in what was going on under the bridge, and we didn't see any measurable bank retreat in the aerial photographs. So switching gears to our field monitoring. So kind of a overarching theme of this section is that the bank retreat varied quite a bit in space and time, even along an individual bank face. However, we can kind of take away typical bank retreats along the actively eroding outer banks of meander bends, and that was pretty similar to what we saw from the aerial photograph long-term rates, so about 1/2 foot to 3 foot between consecutive surveys. So that's not quite a full year, but this is the period of time during the year when we might expect to see a lot of erosion with the spring floods and such. And we did see bank retreat up to 16 feet. So we had in study reach 2 here, the triple meander, we saw bank retreat up to 16 feet. From From the bank pin measurements, so those bank pins, just to remind you, some of them, only maybe 2 or 3 of them were located within the study reaches. The rest were located outside the study reaches. The idea there being that we're trying to get an idea of what's going on sort of throughout the rest of the system, not in these areas that were already identified as problem areas. So from those bank pins, we saw bank retreat that corresponded to annual rates ranging from 0.002 to 0.75 feet per year and averaging about 0.3 feet per year. From our terrestrial LiDAR data and observations in the field, we concluded that the areas that we saw very rapid bank retreat, that was likely due to mass failures on near vertical tall banks. So on mass failure being like a collapse of the bank after it's, for example, been undercut. And then similar to what we saw in the aerial photographs, bank retreat occurred on both unforested and forested banks. And the report gets into a little bit of the why of that. So to kind of synthesize what we saw from the long-term aerial photograph analysis and then our shorter-term field study, like I said, sort of the overarching theme is that these bank retreat rates vary quite a bit in space and time. And what we're finding is that the bank retreat is caused by a combination of what we call fluvial erosion, so that's the action of the water against the bank, as well as mass failure processes. And the reason this is important is that if you could have a relatively small flow or sequence of flows that are not necessarily exceptional or extreme, but those smaller flows could lead to rapid bank retreat if the bank is, I have the nearest stability threshold, if the bank is sort of posed to collapse. So you could have a small amount of erosion at the toe that destabilizes the bank, and then the bank fails after the flood. So what we're seeing is that there's not necessarily a simple relationship between the amount of water flowing through and the amount of bank retreat. Like I said, like we saw a couple slides ago, the years of the study were not particularly high annual peaks in that year, yet we still saw erosion up to 16 feet. So another sort of synthesis conclusion here, the areas of rapid bank retreat shared some common characteristics. There was rapid retreat at the outer banks of bends, where the banks were very tall and steep, where there's a lack of stabilizing vegetation, and bank retreat was also commonly associated with the development of bars in the channel. The engineered bank protection, like riprap, gave mixed results and was least effective where banks were tall, steep, and unvegetated, or where riprap was applied in a way that increased turbulence in the surrounding area, so protruding from or poorly aligned with the bank. That being said, there were some places where the riprap placements did appear to keep the bank stable, at least over the period of the study. And then finally, just a note on, we did look at bed elevation changes a bit, but the study period was too short to draw conclusions about whether changes in the elevation of the bed indicate long-term systemic change or short-term responses to individual flow events. So moving on to the modeling part of the study. So just to briefly recap what we did here, we looked at a large number of scenarios that were different combinations of storm intensity and 2 different durations. We looked at if the basin was relatively wet to begin with, or kind of normal soil moisture conditions to begin with. And so we looked at all these different storms under what would be considered current climate, as well as projected future climate. And then finally looked at a few of those design storm scenarios with added storage. So this first slide kind of just covers what does velocity and shear stress look like through the channel. And we care about those parameters because we expect fast velocity, high shear stress to be associated with more erosion. It's a greater erosive force on the bank from the flow. So what we found is that fast velocity and high shear stress occurs where the channel is relatively narrow and relatively straight. So where the channel is relatively narrow, you're forcing the same amount of flow through, it has to move faster. And where it's relatively straight, that means the channel actually is steeper there because it's not taking such a twisty path. And then interestingly, what we found was that the sort of hot spots of velocity and shear stress were not located in the study reaches, which were kind of known erosion hotspots. The study reaches are generally pretty wide from all of that erosion and pretty twisty. So we were trying to understand why we weren't seeing this very high velocities in those study reaches where we know erosion is a problem. And there are some reasons for why this occurs. So, for example, we're using a more recent terrain model, a more recent topography of the channel in our model to try and understand past change. And so that there's kind of a mismatch there where the erosion that had caused those spots to widen and become more sinuous occurred in the past, and now we're using that already widened channel to try and understand why that widening occurred in the model. We also know, and this gets in the weeds a little bit, that a two-dimensional hydraulic model, the type of model we're using, can't fully describe all the nuance of what happens when water flows through a tight bend. So there are some components of the processes that are not modeled fully by a two-dimensional model. And then finally, our model doesn't address the resistance to erosion or mass failures. So that is sort of what we tried to address with the bank stability modeling. So we'll get to that. So when we look then at what climate change does, it's a pretty simple conclusion. There's more rain predicted in this area because of climate change, and this leads to more flow. So we see percent increases in rainfall total in 2050, ranging from 6 to 10%, depending on the storm scenario, and in 2099 from 9 to 24%. And that leads to corresponding increases in the peak flow created by each of those storms, as well as the total runoff volume. So the total amount of water that gets routed through the river for each of those storms. And when we look then at velocity and shear stress, we see that the climate change scenarios have a slightly higher velocity, up to 12% higher, and a higher shear stress, up to 20% higher than the current climate scenarios, but it's the same spatial pattern. So in this plot here, the black line is showing the current climate scenario, and then the blue and red lines are kind of showing the worst case scenario is the red line, and then the sort of lower bound of the scenarios that we looked at for climate change is the blue line. So you can see it follows the same general pattern as the black line, which is our current climate. We also found that the greatest increases in velocity and shear stress tended to be located in places where velocity and shear stress were already high. And because of this, we ended up with more variability in velocity and shear stress in the study area overall with the climate change scenarios. For looking at the effects of adding storage in the basin, we added, so there are a few existing reservoirs, those are shown in blue, that are included in the model. And we added some hypothetical storage at the dots shown in red that are equivalent to the amount of storage provided by this reservoir here, Reservoir 101. And we looked at scenarios where the reservoir started empty, and we looked at scenarios where they started 3/4 full. And we looked at current climate scenarios and one of the climate change scenarios for the year 2050. So we were really interested in the results from this. What we found was that adding storage resulted in pretty substantial decreases in peak flow, total runoff, velocity, and shear stress throughout the whole study area. And we found that adding storage more than mitigated the effect of climate change on those parameters: peak flow, total runoff, velocity, and shear stress. So in this plot, we've got sort of our current climate and climate change scenarios are those solid lines. And then our added storage scenarios are these dotted lines underneath. So you can see that adding that additional storage more than mitigated the climate change effects. It brings those lines below, well below even the current climate scenarios. We did see that the effect decreases with distance downstream. So as you move, so left to right here is upstream to downstream. So as you move downstream, all those lines start getting closer together. And that's because the effect of that added storage is decreasing as we sort of get more and more area contributing from the basin. And without getting too in the details of this plot, what we found was that the added storage was most effective for smaller storms, which occur more frequently. Whereas the larger storms were more likely to fill the storage. So the added storage was less effective for those larger storms, but those larger storms occur less frequently. So to sort of summarize this second part of the study, we found that those future design storms were predicted to have more rainfall, which leads to higher peak flows, greater total runoff volume, faster velocity, and greater shear stress, as well as more variability in the study area. Adding storage resulted in substantial decreases in those parameters. And then finally, that the hydrologic and hydraulic modeling only gives us part of the story, which is how strong is the flow. So it doesn't address the factors that resist erosion, and it doesn't address mass failures. So the last piece of the study was to try to simulate bank retreat with a bank stability model at a couple of key locations in Cox Creek. So we did this we picked one location in each of the study reaches except for study reach 3, which was the one where we didn't really observe much bank retreat. And so what we found with this work was, as expected, the bigger storms that occur less frequently resulted in more bank retreat than the smaller storms. So that's sort of an obvious answer that helps us understand that our model at least is working somewhat. We did not simulate scenarios with additional with additional storage with our bank stability model, but it's likely that the additional storage would result in reduced bank retreat compared to the same design storm with existing storage. So since we saw this nice relationship between the size of the storm and the amount of bank retreat that was observed or that was simulated in the model, we would expect that the additional storage would result in reduced bank retreat. Overall, the results did show that we think that the simulations might have been under predicting bank retreat, but it's hard to state this definitively. We didn't have quite as much detail as we would have liked on the bank material properties to be able to feel more confident in sort of the quantitative results from the bank stability simulations. So we're sort of looking at it more qualitatively. And there were some important processes that the bank stability model does not capture, which is why we think it may have been under predicting bank retreat. And some of those important processes are listed below. So some final takeaways. Our climate change predictions did indicate more rain, more flow, faster velocity, and shear stress. But that adding storage in the basin could mitigate that increase in flow. That's related to climate change for many of the design storm scenarios. But, and it's a big but, the flow is only part of the story. The mass failure processes and factors that affect resistance to erosion and bank stability are important in why erosion occurs where it does. Oh, I didn't apparently not finish that slide. In other words, like a near vertical bank with minimal vegetation is it doesn't take much to erode that bank. The flow could erode just a small amount of the toe, which might destabilize the bank and cause a mass failure, even in a relatively small flow event. So with that, I'm happy to take questions and happy to give additional detail if needed. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Ms. Edens.
I do have questions, but I saw that there was the potential for extra slides. So I just want to encourage you, if you have more information that you want to share, to go ahead and do that. We're all ears, and this is a big deal for us because we've been waiting on this 2 years. So I just want to give you time if you want to take it for a couple extra slides.
Is there anything in particular you'd like to see? I can focus on whatever component of the study that you like. I just did not want to take too much of the time on the agenda.
I appreciate that. I can kind of tell you what some of my questions were, if that would be helpful.
Yeah. That'd be great.
So I represent, among other areas that you looked at, specifically R6. And so I know that we have detention and retention basin studies, later on the agenda, and for that's largely an update. But when you're talking about building or increasing areas for storage to then slow the runoff, are you primarily thinking about increasing volume of areas that already exist to retain or detain, or are you thinking about adding new areas? And if so, where would you suggest those would be? So I know, just anecdotally, we've talked about, Paul is a commission member at the back of his subdivision. He's talked about it with MSD. There's a hill with a tremendous amount of runoff, and that would have been a great place for MSD to have put something between those two neighborhoods. I know that there's a field that's supposed to flood or could flood. It doesn't at the Highlands. Instead, it heads down towards the bridge and the road. So I'm not sure if there's potential to maybe put something in that area.
So the storage that was added in the basin was 3 totally new locations. It was not increasing the capacity of any of the existing reservoirs. In locating those 3 new reservoirs, we did look at aerial photographs, and we didn't put them on a house, for example. We found open areas to put those into, and we sited them towards the upstream end of the study reach so that it would influence as much of the study reach as possible. If you site them further downstream, then they're not going to have any effects on the upstream part of the basin. So does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so. I just, in the past, when we've had conversations with MSD or engineers, it's been about building up pre-existing structures. And so I was trying to reconcile that.
Sure.
There we go. You say you picked these sites. I noticed they were picked way upstream. Was there any particular thought given to where to put them? And from your placement, can we assume that's where you would recommend we place 3 additional ones? Or is this all just hypothetical?
So the placement of the additional storage was, there were a couple of things that we were thinking about. First, to have an effect on the whole study reach, we wanted to site them upstream of the study reach. If we, like I said, if we had them further downstream, then any of the area upstream of those contributing areas of where the reservoirs were sited would not have any effect. And then the other consideration was where is there open space that is not already developed land that could potentially have a reservoir sited on it. So those are the considerations. And then as far as the amount, we picked basically doubling the effect of the reservoir that is currently the only one that's upstream from the study area. And then as far as making a recommendation, that's where it made sense for our modeling practice to do for the purpose of this study. I think it would be critical to get the input from an engineer on further details for citing those.
You must have cited them based on water flow, though, and water volume at those particular points? Or was it
Right.
just strictly arbitrary? Here's an empty spot, let's put one here. And if so, what was the volume of the reservoir you assumed?
So the intent was to have them upstream from the study area. So the contributing area that goes into that reservoir being upstream from where the problem reaches were in Cox Creek. And then the volume of them, the 3 added reservoirs combined equal the volume of the reservoir that is currently the only reservoir that's upstream from the study reach.
Okay, so the 3 new ones you added equaled I'm not sure I got that right, equaled the upstream reservoirs that already exist? It's doubled the capacity?
Yeah, so it doubled the capacity of what's currently upstream from the study reach.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I read the report more than once, but I think the reason I'm confused is, did I miss a page that had a map of showing where those 3 reservoirs are? And if so, what page is it? Because I must have, I did miss that
I'll pull up
twice.
the map and just give me a moment.
It's actually on 26. But it's they're just generally located, doesn't specifically say where.
Yes, so it's on, thank you for pulling up the page. It's on page, like you said, it's on page 26. And so that's as part of the USGS, we're not we have no authority to do design work. So we've provided the sort of scientific side of things, like what happens if added storage is put within the basin, but we
Yes,
can't.
gotcha. Okay, I saw this. I thought there was something more specific with like a lot locator number and a different picture, and I just missed it. Okay, I'm back with you.
Great.
We're good now. I appreciate you avoiding areas that perhaps had homes. I know in the past we have used grant money to buy flood areas and houses actually closer to Fox Creek. So I was just wondering, this is more of a departmental question, if there's an area that you would have preferred but didn't pick, if there was potential for a buyout system, but that's neither here nor there. Okay, thank you. I did see this one.
Mr. Sturman.
Yes, I have 2 questions. Reading through all of this, the conditions that cause less or more retreat of the banks is almost endless. But it was a great report. The one thing that hit me, I think it was in Reach Area 5. It spoke of area that had, I assume it was the bank covered with riprap. And then there was a statement, it says when the flow of water went past the riprap downstream, that it accelerated. I guess the velocity accelerated. I guess velocity. It was meant, that was meant, it accelerated. And also the bank retreat was also increased. And now, correct me if I've got that wrong. It would seem to me it would slow down the velocity and do just the opposite. I think it was near the Strecker Bridge.
Sure. I can pull up a picture.
I'm sorry, I don't have the page.
No, that's okay. Just give me a moment. So is this the area you're speaking about? Study Reach 5?
I think so.
Yeah, that's the one.
And the reason, if I'm correct, if I don't have that wrong, incorrectly, when we studied and had designs presented to us, the types of bank designs, putting the bank back on an angle of repose, which I suppose this would have to be angled back. The systems would be not continuous. They would be for a while and then it would not occur. They would cease and then another one would begin. And so if I've got this correctly, that seems to me that they would cause an increase in the velocity once the water went past the erosion controlled treatment, that it would actually be worse. But do I have that correctly on the riprap though? On the first, I should have, that was the bank and it actually did cause an acceleration, a bank retreat.
So we're hypothesizing here that this pile of riprap, since it's protruding out into the flow, and it's a relatively small part of the bank, that as the water moves around that, it becomes, first of all, it's constricting the flow, so that's going to cause acceleration. So the water is going to speed up. And then as it's moving around, it's creating more turbulence. So, when you're in an airplane and you're experiencing turbulence, you're bouncing up and down, right? And so it's sort of a similar concept. The water is mixing up, more turbulent, and that gives the water more erosive power to it. So even though it might not be moving the riprap pile, in the wake behind the riprap pile, as you move downstream, where the flow starts to hit the bank again, you've got increased turbulence in the flow, which increases the ability of the water to move sediment. Does that answer your question?
Well, yeah, I'm still confused. If we do, as I described, it was by the engineers describing how to put the erosion control treatment on the banks, and it's with boulders, angle repose, geofabric boulders, and vegetation. And they would just go for segments, stop and start. So it would seem to me where you put the treatment, then it would be constricted, maybe perhaps a little bit. And then at the end of that treatment, it would cause the same activity or same water motion that you've just described, which are turbulence, thank you. Turbulence that would make cause more erosion where the treatment doesn't occur.
So
Am I making,
I think I'm understanding. So you've seen a engineering proposal to lay this bank back and riprap it over more of the area of the bank. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I think I caught. Yeah.
Right. So what we've seen in some of the other,
would you please repeat? I was speaking. Would you please repeat that?
Oh, I guess I just want to understand the question.
Yeah.
So are you asking about like if this whole bank was laid back and riprapped, what do I think would happen?
Yes.
Okay.
Right. Let's say either riprap, or let's imagine that having a well-designed, engineered bank erosion control system. And the common one I keep seeing is angle the bank to the angle of repose and probably some geofabric and then some boulders, about 18, 24-inch boulders placed sporadically from top to bottom, and then begin the growth of some vegetation between the boulders. And that's what I'm seeing. And if that were that kind of system where this riprap was, so the idea, it protrudes inward some and possibly causes turbulence.
Okay, so I think I understand your question now. So what we found is that the places where the riprap appears to be working are places where the riprap is not just in a small pile like here, but is over a more extended area. B, is aligned well with the existing curve, the existing profile of the bank. So again, here it's just a pile that's sticking out from the bank. So sort of the opposite of that. And then finally, where the banks are not particularly tall is where, so those are the sort of characteristics of the places where the existing riprap treatments seem to have been stable over either our study period or in the cases where we could see them in aerial photos over that longer aerial photo period. So there are places where the riprap, we observed it working fairly well. And then the places where we saw it not working particularly well are sort of the opposite of those characteristics, places where it's a small, relatively small pile like this one and it's sticking out from the bank, or there's another location further downstream where it's kind of misaligned with the curve of the bank, like if you were to view it from above. So that's kind of the observations that we saw playing out in the real world from your study area here.
Okay, thank you. The other question I like to ask is, when it comes to vegetation and root systems on a bank, and when it's helpful or not helpful, the opposite, apparently where the root system vertically is the proportion of it versus the total height of the bank, the lower it is, and I guess the higher the percentage of the depth of the root system going down into the bank, whether it is trees or low growing, is that the ideal? And where it's a tall bank and any root system is just a small sliver at the top, has adverse condition to the bank erosion?
Yeah, I think you've got that pretty spot on. In the unforested areas where we saw rapid bank retreat, it's mostly grassy vegetation that doesn't have a very deep root, so it's not providing very much strength to the bank. But like we said, like you just said, if the banks are very tall, you could even have trees up there, and they're rooting. You're still potentially having erosion there, even though you've got more deeply rooting vegetation. And in the case of the Triple Meander area study Reach 2, yes, you've got forested banks, but the banks themselves are nearly vertical and steep. It's not like you've got vegetation actually growing into the bank, providing strength that way. And in those cases, the weight of the tree can actually potentially contribute to destabilizing the bank. So yes, you're right. The depth of the root and how that certainly affects how much it's going to hold together the bank. If the vegetation is sitting up on top of the bank versus actually on the face of the bank, that's going to affect how much strength it provides to the bank as well.
And just one more thing. What is more advantageous root system to have on the edges of these banks? Is it trees, or is it other kind of low growing vegetation? Or I suppose there's some species of plants that have the best root system for bank stabilization.
Yeah, that gets a little bit out of my area of expertise. So I don't feel comfortable giving you an answer on that.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Leroy, you actually brought up what I was going to ask you about, which is the area around Reach 2, which sounded like a lot of what you were describing in a couple different ways, none of which sounded like we were in good shape there. And that's an area that we know is a problem, but we've somewhat moved away from just because of the financial realities of trying to solve that, we thought perhaps we could do more work in other places. But you know, all of the engineering that I'm thinking about that we've had done in that area, it's really addressing the banks specific to, you know, the triple meander itself, where it's kind of twisting and turning, and not so much the probably 30-foot tall banks along some of the road leading into that. So I'm just wondering, in your opinion, like what do you do to try to help these very, very tall vertical banks? Because I don't know, I mean, like, they do have trees, big trees on top of them, which can't help this situation. What is some advice you guys might offer on how to address something like that?
So here, well, I'll pull that up so that we can have our eyes on something. I always find that's helpful. Okay, so yeah, these kinds of very tall, steep banks. So you did do a lot of work on this one, right? This is the one that got laid back and rip-wrapped. And that was fairly effective, but as you noted, it's extremely costly and labor intensive. So I think you kind of answered your own question there, which is that to really do something in these areas, it's going to be very costly work. It's going to be laying back the bank and adding riprap and a big construction project, because the way these banks are right now, they're so tall, they're so steep, they're so vertical, they're so fine grained. It doesn't take much. Like I said, it could take a relatively small flow to erode the toe of that bank and potentially generate a mass failure. Yeah, I think what you've done in this section here seems, at least from the aerial photograph record so far, to be fairly effective. But like you said, it's fairly expensive as well.
Well, and I'm thinking especially because there are some areas there that the banks are like right on, isn't it McBride Point, right? Right there. The bank is almost to the road, isn't it? At the beginning of the neighborhood?
Oh, here? Or this one?
Yeah, more towards Clayton Road, where the towards the bottom of that picture. I guess there's more space than I thought, but right at the corner there, I mean, that's where it's super tall. Whatever. So great. More money. Cool. I like. Excellent. All right. Well, I do think we need to probably look a lot at that and figure that stuff out. We're, working on some funding as always for this stuff. Okay. Anybody have anything else? Yes, sir.
Figure out how to push that button is the big thing. Just so to clarify, I didn't find any recommendations in this report from the USGS. Is that correct? This is basically an engineering study. True?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. If we ask you to step out of that role slightly and say, out of all of the 6 areas you studied, what are the ones that you see that where would you recommend we put our priorities?
That's a really good question. Let me think about that for a moment. I think what our study showed was that adding storage does have an effect on, at least on the flow, on what drives the fluvial component of erosion. So that's not going to be a panacea. It's not going to solve all the problems, but it is going to reduce the stress of the flow on the channel.
So am I understanding and reading between the lines that the best thing we could do is to get more storage rather than trying to piecemeal fixes along the way, which also obviously need to be done, but to fix it in its most expedited fashion, it would be to give the system more storage.
Yeah, that's the only thing that's going to have a system-wide effect. Anything else, any treatment is going to be a local treatment. And it may be effective locally, but it is not necessarily going to help the entire stretch of the channel.
And just a final follow-up on that is that you added three new reservoirs. And did you consider at all increasing the capacity of the existing ones instead of adding new ones?
So with the way that this model works, in some ways, it effectively is doing the same thing in terms of what the model actually sees. So I would not anticipate that if we were to, rather than put those three new reservoirs, if we were to just double the size of the one that was there, I would guess it would be a fairly similar result, but not exactly the same, because by spreading the reservoirs out, you're starting to cover different contributing areas to the channel. So instead of just like one sub basin that's contributing to the channel, you're hitting three. And so that's potentially going to increase the effectiveness of that strategy.
Thank you.
Lauren.
I was just gonna build off of Commissioner Oaks's response and questions. I really appreciated the map that you had that had the stars on it that showed the bridge locations and correspondence to the stretch of areas that was studied. So kind of to answer your question, part of the council's job and the commissioner's job in determining what the priorities are, it's Dr. Leroy's advice that tells us how the ecosystem's working, what the rate of change that we can expect to see is over time. But what our job is to take into account, if we do have money for piecemeal, which we still have to do, is ranking that based on critical public need, meaning that is it land owned by the city and we have a responsibility to be first and only the ones that maintain that. The Triple Meander is an example of that. That's 13 acres that we own and are responsible for. Is it quasi-public land where there's multiple jurisdictions, including ourselves, that are responsible versus private land? And then what is the city infrastructure involved? If it's cutting near a road, that's a problem. If it's cutting near a bridge, that's a problem. That moves it up on ranking. Is there a utility pole or water lines or sanitary sewer that is critical infrastructure that can affect public safety and welfare that relates to that area? That's a problem. So all of those, it's our job to kind of consider that as commissioner members and elected officials, but that wasn't her job to weigh in on that. But she helped us by showing us that on a map. And so that's something that I've explained to folks as well, you know, that are concerned about their property and things like, well, we have a tennis court. Well, that's really nice that your neighborhood has a tennis court, but I'm here to fix the fact that your sanitary sewer line's exposed and now we have to get MSD out here. And the fact that this is cutting over near a road and a bridge, that's critical infrastructure that I have to maintain. It is not a we problem, right? That your neighborhood tennis court's flooding. I'm sorry about it, but that's not a we problem, right? So those are just the kind of discussions that we'll have to have. But I did really, really appreciate that map.
Mr. Vunich.
Mr. Chair, I just have a quick question for Dr. Leroy, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Dr. Leroy, in part 3, you mentioned that the model did not take into account certain scenarios or certain items, one of which was the protection of the bank by deposited sediment. Dr. Hammer had talked about trying to reestablish the bow wag in the center of the creek and pushing that deposited material over to the bank. Any opinion on that?
So I'll just clarify first. So what I meant with what the model doesn't include is that, let's say a mass failure occurs on the bank, that sediment doesn't just disappear. In the real world, that sediment slumps down lower onto the bank. In fact, we saw that in our terrestrial LiDAR scans. And so in the model, though, it does kind of just disappear. So if you destabilize the bank, it slumps you've now got sediment sitting on the toe that's going to protect the toe during the next flow event that comes in. And so Dr. Hammer was proposing to move some of the sediment that was deposited on the bars down towards the toe. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, Dr. Leroy, we have so much material in the creek. The thought of bringing new material into the creek seemed like counterproductive. Why not use what's there? Now, it's not necessarily engineered by size, but we've kind of debated back and forth as using it in place to give us temporary relief.
Well, I think you're right that it would be temporary. If it does provide any relief, it would be temporary. What we see with the velocities and the shear stress in the channel from our model, and then also just based on how mobile the bed was, the amount of change that we saw on the channel bed in our terrestrial LiDAR scans, is that the sediment that's on the bed in there right now is mobilized, is moving under the flows that at least that we observed during the study period and with the flows that we modeled. The flows that we modeled were greater, stronger than the flows that occurred in the study period. But what we could see with our terrestrial LiDAR scans is that there was change on the bed. And so we can infer from that that sediment is moving. And so I think that sediment is mobile under even the last, the 2 years of the study, which were not particularly huge events. So any relief it provides, I think, would be temporary.
Mr. Chair, one last question. So from the perspective of the existing channel in Cox Creek, you mentioned that even with existing vegetation on the banks, given the bank's characteristics, that did nothing to necessarily stop mass failure. So is it an overgeneralization to say that without treating the bank first, any types of plantings generally aren't going to be successful?
I think if you've got a nearly vertical bank like what we're showing, so what I showed in that picture, then planting vegetation on the top of that bank it's not going to be particularly helpful, because you still have that whole exposed face of fine-grained sediment that is just very easily moved by or eroded by the flow.
Does the study conclusion change dependent on the height of the bank?
Yeah, so the tall banks are going to be more prone to mass failure because they're heavier. You've got more weight of sediment up above the toe of the bank, and so they're more easily destabilized.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Dr. Leroy, thank you.
Yeah,
But just
I did have
finish up there.
one more.
Even where the banks were shorter, but you had sort of that near vertical face, those are still going to be more easily eroded and prone to mass failure because the sediment is so exposed and the geometry of the bank is so vertical.
Is there like a magic number that defines what is a tall bank and what is not a tall bank?
So no, it's going to depend on your bank material characteristics. In this case, like in this study, we're looking at banks that are not easily overtopped by the flows that occurred during the study period. So if the bank is not easily flooded, I would consider it tall. That means the river has incised so deeply that it doesn't flood on a regular basis.
So Dr. Leroy, one last comment. So anywhere where we have vertical banks, generally speaking, regardless of their height, those are the areas where we probably need to focus our attention.
Yes, because that's a sign that erosion is actively occurring. those tall vertical banks with no vegetation, if you've got overhanging live roots, those are all signs that that's a place where erosion is occurring.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Is there any final words or anything you'd like to offer us? You know, maybe if 40 to 70 million dollars to fix the problem, something like that.
I don't have 40 to $70 million. But I will say I was surprised by how effective the added storage was, at least at mitigating the flow component of your problem. And so, like I said, it's not going to solve every last issue that you've got, but it is promising, at least in regards to the fluvial erosion component.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for all your guys' hard work. We really appreciate it. And thank you for the very thorough explanation and report. It will be very helpful. All right, Mr. Vunich, up next, we've got our detention retention basin studies. Let's hear this one.
Good, Mr. Chair, thank you. Mr. Chair, members of the task force, as you know, based upon what we've just discussed, additional storage, whether it be new facilities or existing ones retrofitted to new standards, appear to be a solution to some of our problems. Also, as the task force is aware, we've engaged Joe Wilson of Wilson Hydro and Todd Wagner of Todd Wagner and Associates, LLC, to investigate 7 basins in the upstream portion of the Cox Creek watershed. That work has taken a little longer than had hoped. Again, part of that was related to the fact that we had to survey each of those basins to ensure that if retrofits were made, we wouldn't end up having water in the low sill areas of some of the homes that surround them, meaning that lowest opening in the basement generally. And so we are getting close, as was referenced in the memorandum, and those points came from Mr. Wagner as well. Mr. Wagner is in attendance tonight, and we'll do a quick update relative to the status of the study and the direction we need to head from this point forward. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Wagner, take it away.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, good. I'm going to try to share my screen.
It's like we can see it. We can see it.
Okay, just a second. Let me get. Do you see my PowerPoint?
We did for just a second and then it clicked off. We're seeing
Okay.
Zoom right now.
Just a second. I'll get it back here. Juggling 2
There we go.
screens. Now you see it?
Now we see it. Yes, sir.
Oh, okay, good. I can't see myself, so I hope I'm in the view of the camera. I believe I am. Thank you all for having me back, and I want to give you an update of the Cox Creek Detention Basin retrofit design. And just due to some of the factors that Joe mentioned, and then other factors with workload and other things, this has gone a little longer than I had wanted it to. But one thing that I'm seeing now in the last couple of weeks and seeing the USGS work, it's actually really exciting to be wrapping this up along with the USGS, because this is actually fitting together a lot better than I had really even anticipated when the USGS started. Now that I got to see, we're seeing the results of their study and looking at what we're doing. I really like how this is fitting together. So I'm going to give you a quick update of where we are, and we're going to be making a few changes or a few additions or a few additional observations and things that we want to look at with the USGS data now, or the study now available to us. So I want to point that out, and I'll revisit that at the end. Also, there was several questions asked, and if you don't mind, there at the end of Dr. Leroy's presentation, and I'd like to address those just briefly and hopefully helpfully in some ways that will hopefully help you all understand somewhat of what we were proposing and how that relates to what the study is showing, what Dr. Leroy was stating. Let's just go ahead and get started. I want to touch on a couple of things to make sure that it's been a while and make sure that we're all on the same page. There may be some new people on the task force. And so I just want to make sure that a few real basic concepts here are clear. One is the general approach that we're taking when we're looking at retrofitting detention basins in the upper Hawks Creek watershed, and similar to what Dr. Leroy hypothetically put into her model. The main thing that we're looking to do is look for opportunities to restrict discharge to a lower discharge rate coming from the detention basin, to increase the storage in the basin during flood events, and that will typically be by increasing the pond elevation. So we're doing that very carefully, and so we'll see a little bit of that in this presentation. The main thing that we're focusing on when we are decreasing flow discharge and increasing storage is we're focusing on those particular storms and those particular discharge rates that cause erosion. And just like what you just heard, when a channel is flowing a third or a half or 3/4 full, different channels are slightly different, but when they're flowing about half full or more, they tend to start eroding. And smaller storms, because they occur on a regular basis and they last for the flows may be up for a longer period of time, longer, more gradual rainfalls. Actually, those are the ones that often cause you the most problems in erosion rather than that 100-year event. Whereas, yeah, it may do a lot of damage, but it only happens once every 100 years, or at least theoretically. And so in the long run, most of the damage is done to your channels by those smaller events or those longer, more gradual rainfalls that keep your channel flowing full of water for a longer period of time, or maybe half full of water. Particularly on Cox Creek, where it only has to flow half full. And just like we were just talking, it'll undercut the bottom half of your channel wall, and then the top half will fall in as mass wasting. And so you have, even though you didn't have a huge rainfall event, you can still have massive amounts of erosion, and that's what's happening in this background picture that you're looking at right now. So we're focusing on those flows. We're focusing on the change in the increasing the amount of storage above the normal permanent pool. So the ponds that are permanent pool, we call them ponds rather than detention basins, and at least I will tonight. Those ponds, we're trying to increase the amount of volume above the permanent pool. The amount of volume below the permanent pool, although cleaning out sediment might give you some benefits, that doesn't have any impact on your downstream erosion. So it's focused on what's above the permanent pool. Let's dive in here, and after hitting just a few principles, just to kind of reorient yourself. You saw some maps before. This one's probably not a great map, but it is Cox Creek. And so what you see in the bottom half, the black line is the outline of Cox Creek. The yellow spots are detention basins all across the watershed. The south half, or the lower half of this watershed, from the words Cox Creek to the south, is what we're calling the upper Cox Creek watershed. And so that's where we're wanting to put detention storage. Same thing that Dr. Leroy's was evaluating. She wanted to put in some storage in some places in the upper parts of the Cox Creek. There's There are 6 circles you see there. The one on the right actually circles 2 basins. So that is the 7 detention basins that we have zeroed in on as looking at the possibility of retrofitting these basins to decrease the flows downstream, as we were just talking about. The large yellow area in the south central part there is Lake Chesterfield. And so the part that I've circled there just upstream of that is harbors at Lake Chesterfield, or that smaller lake that's just upstream. I believe, if I understood Dr. Leroy's assumption, she was talking about the one reservoir in the upper watershed. She was referring to, I'm sure, to the Lake Chesterfield. That is the one very large reservoir, much larger than everything else. And so what she did was she created 3 different basins and placed them in 3 different sub basins or sub watersheds, and made those 3 basins, all 3 together have the same volume as that one Lake Chesterfield lake, the big one, right? The one reservoir that she referred to. So that's what her assumption was. I've just gotten a hold of the USGS report in the last couple of weeks and haven't had a chance to digest it yet, but I'm really excited now to look at what she did exactly and to see how that compares to what we're doing here, and to see how closely, hopefully, we can match what she assumed, and see some of the positive results that she said she was seeing in adding that storage. So let's first look at the West Glen detention basin, the first of the 7. This was our highest ranked basin, as far as the one that we thought had the most potential to lower flow rates. And so you can see the location there circled in red. On the right side is this is what I call the west branch of the upper Cox Creek watershed. So this goes up, includes the area where you all are located right now. Does not include Lake Chesterfield, but it does include the town center there. And so the West Glen Basin is way up at the top right-hand corner of that diagram on the right. And it catches just about 40 or 50 acres of drainage off of that last blue line up there in the top right-hand corner. That's the flow line, or the flow area that flows into West Glen Basin. So it's a relatively small area that drains to it, but we are able to reduce flow rates quite a bit. So here's the basin. Here's a survey of the basin. And so what that shows you there is that it drains straight out of a discharge structure at the southeast part of it there, and drains into a creek, which is just a couple thousand feet upstream of the main channel of Cox Creek. So it has a pretty direct effect on Cox Creek because it's so close. This is what it looks like. The discharge structure on the left, on the right, what you're seeing is grouted riprap in the channel that it discharges into. And then that lower right-hand corner, or the picture in the lower right-hand corner, is a little hard to tell in that picture, but this basin, the berm, has several low points on it. Right now, that doesn't make a big difference because the basin is so big and the outlet structure is so big compared to the watershed, that the basin never fills up. It never even comes close to filling up. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for basins that have storage, but it's not being utilized. It's just wasted storage right now. And so what we want to do is restrict the storage, restrict the discharge, and create more storage, and cause the water surface to go higher in these basins. But if we do that, we're being very cautious. And one of the things we saw here was this berm has a lot of low points on it. So we're going to need to level the top of the berm at a specific elevation and make sure it's very level. Right now, it's got low points that sag as much as about a foot, and that could lead to an overtopping at a particular point and cause a washout of the basin if we're not careful. So that kind of sets the stage for what the recommended modifications are at this location. That's the illustrated areas that we're modifying. You see there, if we made a list of that, we would restrict that discharge structure weir wall there that we were looking at. We would restrict that down to where it's a much smaller slot and the weir wall would be higher. We would raise the low points along the level, the top of the berm and make it level. We would put riprap around the perimeter of the pond. If we start causing this pond to fill up more and more often, it's going to increase erosion on the banks. So we want to be sure to protect those banks. Currently, this pond does not have any kind of protection on the banks other than just some roots from the trees. But we would really rather have riprap around the perimeter of the pond to be sure and prevent any bank erosion from beginning to occur. We would recommend that you would concrete or riprap around the inflow pipe and the outlet structure. That kind of goes with the last one. We would recommend remove the failing grouted riprap in the stream, which is falling apart, causing more gravel and rock to be scoured out and to go downstream. And it's just not healthy for the stream to have that. It's causing unnecessary erosion. We would rather see just a natural stone drop structure there that would look like a natural drop in a creek. We'd also advise you to add a grass emergency spillway. So that would just be a dip in the berm, but it would be reinforced with some type of matting or something that would prevent the berm from washing out. But we would want to have an emergency spillway since we're increasing the possibility that the pond could fill up completely if it had a blockage or if you had a 500-year rainfall event. So we want to provide a safe way for that overtopping to occur through an emergency spillway. And there would be, with this plan, a small easement required for one private property, about triangular piece of land about 10 by 20 feet, just because that's a low spot. We were to look at the benefits of this, of these changes. You're looking at a 75% reduction in flows, those important flows that cause downstream erosion. So this one is the biggest change that we'll see in any of these, reducing the flow to about 1/4 of what it was before for those important storms that are the 2-year storm or the 5-year storm, those ones that cause the most erosion. And it also decreases the duration of these, I'll call them dangerous channel forming discharges that cause erosion. It decreases the duration of that and keeps it below that level. So that's important to protect your downstream banks from erosion. There's way too much on this slide. I apologize, but the bottom line is literally the bottom line there is about $250,000 for this particular location to do what I just outlined. And so that's the first one. Let's move on. Let's keep moving here so I'm not, don't go too long. Copper Lake is another one that we're looking at. This is in the east branch of the upper Cox Creek watershed. So now you see Lake Chesterfield there right in the middle of this watershed. It's shaded in yellow. It drains north and it goes to that blue pin at the top is where it all comes out. And so the Copper Lakes detention basins are, you can see the Lake Chesterfield Basin. It's southeast of there, two much smaller ponds there just southeast of the Lake Chesterfield Basin. And so here's an up close of that. On the right side, you see the watershed that drains into these two basins. They're they're in tandem, one right after the other. One thing that I want to point out is that the survey of those two basins is on the left. They each sort of have an overflow spillway, but not really. Unfortunately, for these ponds, if they were to spill over, they would probably flood a house before they would actually spill over. But the good news is why that hasn't happened is because the outlet structures are so oversized, so large, that the ponds, again, they just don't hold much water. The water pretty much just runs into the pond, out the outlet structure, and it never really ponds up very much. So you don't get very much benefit. Again, that's the same scenario we had on the last one. We're looking for ponds that have the potential to hold more water. So if we look at this pond, it is the lower pond of the two, or lower elevation wise, but north of the other pond. This pond has, you can really see all the modifications that we want to do here in these pictures. You have some bank erosion. It's pretty bad, and it will get worse if we cause the pond to hold water more often, to go up and down more. So you have the bank erosion. You have these stakes that have been from something in the past on the left. There's an abandoned pipe in the bank on the right. If we were to put riprap around the pond, we could clean that up and get rid of some of these old artifacts that are left over. You see the outlet structure. It's kind of small, but it's on the right there. It actually has massive overflow capacity, about double of what's really needed here. And so it doesn't hold water. So what we would propose is to block part of those openings to restrict the water more, to limit how fast it can flow out and cause the water to pond up more and get more storage and decrease the downstream discharges. So if we do that, we want to do that very carefully. And we'll talk about that in a minute. There's also, this pond is probably the pond with the most sediment in it and the shallowest of all the ponds we looked at. So it would be something that you might want to look at, having it excavated on the left there. It's very shallow there, maybe a foot or two deep over a large part of it. So that leads to overheating and algae growth and some water quality issues. So if we were in there working on riprapping the banks, you can see on the right side, the riprap below the pipe coming in has been displaced and isn't really serving its function very well. That would all be cleaned up as part of the riprapping of the perimeter of the lake. And you could do some sediment removal along the way and improve the lake itself too, the water quality in the lake. So that would be something to consider. So if we were to look at the upper lake and the lower lake, we just saw pictures there of the lower lake, but the upper lake is similar, except it does have riprap already. So the upper lake or the south lake, we would propose to modify the outlet by blocking some of the openings, put a notch in the outlet structure that would actually allow the water to, on a permanent pool basis, it would drop it about 6 inches, thereby gaining even more volume, which helps you decrease downstream flows even more. And then also there is a grass spillover that we would propose to drop that about a foot so that we can make sure that it will spill over and run through the common area out to the street and on down to the inlets in the street before it would flood any homes. So that would be the components in the upper lake. And then the lower lake would be very similar to that, except it would also involve riprapping the perimeter of the bank. And perhaps even installing a cutoff trench to protect one house next to it that has a basement that's actually lower than the water surface of the pond. So if we're going to propose to raise the pond level at times during flood events, I would recommend putting in some type of a cutoff, clay cutoff trench that would stop water movement from moving in the direction of the house with the basement. So those are some safety factors that we would like to put into this: the emergency spillway or emergency overflow pipe, and the cutoff trench. All the while, we're blocking part of the inlet to cause the water surface to go up and down more with each rainfall, because when it does, it holds more water and it decreases the downstream discharge, and that's what we're ultimately after. And so I'm finishing up the model and report on this one, but it looks like we're going to reduce flow in this scenario by modifying both ponds by about 20%. So that's significant. It's not as much as the others, but it is a pretty significant decrease in flow. And fine tuning that to get exactly what we want as far as what our downstream stream channels are going to see as far as flow, so we can reduce erosion. This one, the upper lake's about 40,000, the lower lake's about 180,000. So Copper Lakes total about 220,000. If we go look at harbors at Lake Chesterfield, this is the smaller pond just upstream of the big Lake Chesterfield Lake, right in the middle of the watershed there. There's an up close of it. It's a little bit larger than the last two basins that we looked at. And so we see a couple of things that we could modify here. The outlet structure is a little different. In the survey, you can see the outlet structure is at the bottom left-hand corner, I'm sorry, the bottom right-hand corner of your picture, and it's a square overflow structure. And so water just simply comes into the pond and spills into the overflow structure. There's no real restrictions in place that really cause much ponding to occur, particularly in small storms, which are the very storms that we're trying to control in order to stop downstream erosion. So basically, the pond just doesn't do a very good job of protecting downstream erosion the way it is configured now. And so what we wanted to do was just simply modify the concrete on this structure by cutting a notch to lower the permanent pool by 6 inches to a foot, but then also raise the walls to cause it to to have more flood control volume above that permanent pool before it starts to spill over. Of course, when you do that, again, you have the concerns, and the reason I took this picture and showed it to you is there is a house right there near the spillway, the lowest house of all the houses around the perimeter of the pond, and that's the one we would be most concerned about of having some type of a negative impact on that house, because we're going to be raising the water surface during flood events. So we've shot the elevations, and we are making sure that there is plenty of freeboard and plenty of safety factor there, so that house would not be flooded. But it is below the road, the embankment. The just downstream of this structure is a road, which is the embankment for the pond. And if it were ever to become completely blocked and the water had to fill up and spill over the road, it would flood this house and probably another house. Unfortunately, you just should never build houses lower than an embankment that's just downstream, but these houses were built that way. So they're there now, and we'll try to protect them with every reasonable way we can while doing this project and increasing storage. And so that's our goal there. The options here that we see is simply modifying this outlet structure, and then also if the neighborhood was agreeable, there is a pretty gradual slope all along the west side of the pond, or actually this is rotated. It'd be on the east side of the pond. The pictures, north is not up in this picture. So kind of on the southeast side of this pond, the slopes are pretty gradual, and we could get more volume and excavate some sediment out of the pond if we wanted to modify that bank, and that could help reduce downstream flows. If we're looking at harbors at Lake Chesterfield, what do these modifications look like? Blocking up the outlet structure about a foot, cutting a notch in it, maybe 6 inches to a foot, which would lower the permanent pool, but that would increase the amount of flood storage that you would have available, which would allow us to decrease downstream flows, downstream discharge. We could regrade the south bank, southeast bank, if of course if they were agreeable to that, the folks that live there. But we could do that within the common area property. And then there's also quite a bit of riprap failure going on around the perimeter of the pond. And so we would propose to just do some riprap improvements. And one option would be, someone's already mentioned the buyout word. One option would be you could buy out the lowest house, and that would allow you to make some additional modifications to increase the water surface a little bit more during a flood. And so that's always an option. When we get the final report in your hands, it'll have more detail on how to look at options like that, with a little more educated to be able to make a decision on something like that. But that's always something you have to throw out there as a possibility, especially when you have one particular house like that that's pretty low. Again, we're fine tuning this to maximize our downstream reductions. I hope I can get it over 20%, but I'm going to say it's in the 10 to 20% range. That's what it's looking like. And so this one is coming in right around 100,000 to do all of those modifications, not including, of course, the buyout of the house, but all the other modifications right around $100,000 for that. And finally, let's look at let's lump three of the dry ponds together. This is the town center, Deerberg's dry detention basins, and this is the location in the back over to the west branch of the Upper Cox Creek. And this is your development there, downtown area, I guess you call it. And the three orange blocks are your three detention basins. I think, as you've already been told, these are newer basins and they're designed pretty well. In fact, the east two basins, we might be able to modify those a little bit and get a little bit of improvement there on the discharge, but not going to be a whole lot. The bigger one, the Southwest Basin, I think we could get some reduction there. So I think that one's worth pursuing for sure. And there's also some kind of bigger issues with that one. And that is, it's got a lot of sediment in it, a lot of trash, and a lot of tree growth, which, because of these retaining block walls that are about 10 to 12 feet high, that's really going to threaten the integrity of those walls, the roots from these trees. So that's really something that needs to be addressed. So that's kind of all factoring into what I would recommend for that basin. And that is, I wrote on here, modify three control structures. That's just concrete work, cutting or adding concrete. So that's fairly simple. I'm not sure that it's really worth it on the two smaller basins, but on the bigger one, there's some modifications we could definitely make there to restrict the flow more, raise the water surface, get more storage, and reduce downstream flow. Also, I would recommend, while you're at it, cleaning out the sediment, which would give you more volume back, restore some volume that would help. And while you're at it, whoever's responsible for maintaining that, I'm not sure, but it needs to have the trees cleared out, or you're going to have some problems down the road with that the roots getting into those retaining walls. That is, we're looking at pretty good reduction from the one basin. I think we can restrict it down quite a bit more, one large basin, and probably restrict it at least 20%, reduce our flow rates there. And you'd be looking at, if you did all three, $80,000. But cleaning out that basin on the inside is with all the trees and the sediment and everything, that's going to be the bulk of your work there. So if we sum up all of these projects, they come to about $650,000. When we draw these, we'll have a more refined estimate when we have our quantities nailed down. And that is our final step after we've gotten to the point where everybody's feeling pretty comfortable about what's being proposed. We have in our contract to do preliminary drawings, and at least that would allow us to get some quantities and to nail things down a little bit better. But I feel pretty good that the 650 is pretty good ballpark estimate on where you would be at on all of these. Because there has been a lot of interest in the sediment removal from the wet ponds, I did take a look at that. We do have that information on the depths of those ponds. The Copper Lakes North Pond, the downstream pond that does not have any riprap around it that I mentioned earlier, that pond is only about 3 to 4 foot deep on average. You really would like your ponds to be 6 feet deep to be healthy ponds that don't have algae problems. And so that one would be probably the one that I would think about pretty seriously about removing some sediment, or maybe quite a bit of sediment from that one. The South Copper Lake Pond has more storage that could be done, or could have maybe some partial removal of some sediment, just maybe at the south end where the water's coming in. West Glen and harbors at Lake Chesterfield are 5 to 7 feet deep. It's not just screaming out at you that you need to remove sediment from these. And as I was, pondering, telling you that I wouldn't do any sediment removal on those two ponds, it kind of occurred to me that both of those do have some accumulation where the inflow pipe comes in, which is common. So I would probably say do limited sediment removal on that. If you're already doing the riprap work around the perimeter, that it would be a good idea to remove some of the sediment from just the intakes on those ponds. So the numbers that I gave you there are roughly if you did the entire pond and removed a couple feet from all of the ponds. If you just did limited sediment removal on those number 3 and 4 there, those numbers would be much, much lower. And you'd probably be looking at somewhere in the total cost on all of these of maybe 100 to 150,000. So again, this is not going to make a difference in your erosion issues. These are more pond quality issues that while you're in there mucking around, if you want to remove sediment, there'll never be a better time to do it, a more cost-effective time to do it while you're in there. So I threw those out there, and we can always discuss those later. Decide if you want to include that in your projects. We are to the point, this is my last slide, and this is the things that I want to do to wrap up my part of this study or this overall big picture study that you're looking at, which includes the USGS work. I need to spend some time looking at it in a little more detail, and so that I can weave together what they found and what they were assuming and the storage that they put in their models, and compare that to what we're doing here, how much storage we're able to add by doing these retrofits. Now, there was the question about how did she come up with the 3 storage areas. I would be happy to look at those and give a high level, I guess you'd say, an engineering analysis of that, because Dr. Leroy doesn't want to do engineering. She can't, because she works for the USGS. And so I would be happy to look at that, just do a quick look and see, are those in areas where you could feasibly build a detention basin, or were they just more like just conceptual? And so I'll be happy to give you a little feedback on that. Wouldn't take much to do that. Also keep in mind, we did a study a couple years ago for you all, and I threw into that study several places along Cox Creek where you could get storage. And I'm going to look at that work that I did and also compare that to what Dr. Leroy assumed in her storage assumption to get her pretty significant improvements in the watershed. And so I'll also give you that information. And that actually did have a little bit of an engineering approach to it. I did take a little bit of time looking at the feasibility of those storage areas. So stay tuned for that. We will give you some better information, more information on the feasibility of not just retrofitting here, like what we're talking about, but actually adding storage along the main channel in a couple different spots in the upper reaches of Cox Creek. So there's a little bit of additional computer modeling to do with all of this. We were not able to get the model from FEMA. It just wasn't available, is what we were told. But I understand that the USGS actually did get FEMA's model, and so Dr. Leroy's made that available to me. So we are going to look at the cumulative effect of all of these things and how much benefit that we're seeing on the lower part of Cox Creek, where we're having more of the problems. And so that's the last part to finalize the report, is to look at that cumulative effect using the watershed-wide computer models. And I do, while I've got you got the floor, I guess you would say, I would like to say a couple things about the questions that you all were asking Dr. Leroy. One was stream stabilization example, the bad example that was shown there. If I remember right, and Joe can probably, Mr. Vunish can confirm this, I believe that that particular location where she showed you that was a spot where there is a sewer manhole not too far from the bank. And MSD came in and threw rock over the bank to try to prevent the bank from eroding back into their manhole and causing possibly a sewer break. You know, it could be a pretty big disaster if your sewer manhole washed out and you started having raw sewage running into the creek. So they dumped, on more than one occasion, I believe, have dumped water or rock over the bank. That is not a designed stream bank stabilization project. That is just a little patchwork to protect our manhole. That's all that is, and it's working, but unfortunately, it's causing negative effects both upstream and downstream of that spot where they dumped the rock. So I wanted to be sure you understand, when we're looking at stream bank stabilization on a section of a stream bank, we start at a point that's stable and we run that the length of a destabilized bank, and we don't stop it until we get to another point that is stable. And there's also there's numerous design features that go into a stream bank stabilization project that keep them stable for the long run. And you have several examples on Cox Creek, even, or at least a couple that I can think of that have been successful. But there's a number of different features that you can do to protect your project from washing out or eroding behind it, to protect both upstream and downstream. There's veins, there's different things that can be done to control the water, to push it out away from the bank, deflect it back, and let that thalweg naturally develop back, not with going in and excavating rock, but when you put in a vein or some type of diversion or grade control, you cause the thalweg to naturally move back into the middle of the channel and start to become, hopefully, what it looked like a few years ago. You're trying to basically make time go back. And so there's a lot of things that go into these projects. They're designed to function and be stable in a certain way. One really good question, and Mr. Sturman, these are all really good questions about it eroding underneath root systems. And that's true. That's exactly what's going on. You have downgraded these channels. They have incised down so far that they're far, far below the root system of anything you've got out there. So those root systems don't help you anymore. And like you said, you undermine those, and then the weight of the tree falls in, and then the tree lodges downstream and causes more erosion. And it's just, Cox Creek is a creek gone bad. I mean, it's just, it's numerous things, the gravel deposits, the trees falling in, all of these things just keep exacerbating the problem more and more, which is why we need this multi-prong approach to trying to fix it. But the the reasoning behind the way we do these stream stabilization projects is that yes, we want plants at the top, but we have to put in toe stones, what's called toe stones, or there's large boulders that you put in at the toe of the bank. And those toe stones have to go up the bank high enough to where the plantings that go in at the top of the bank, the root systems can start to grow down and get down into the top of the toe stone. So they create this temporary armoring that allows the root systems to begin to grow and to get into that. And then often you'll get root systems actually growing inside the riprap eventually. Different types of native trees can be plugged into those areas to accelerate that growth. And eventually you get this matrix of rocks and root, and the rocks are down at the bottom. That's the toe. They have to be lower than where the roots can get to. But eventually you can get those banks to completely cover up with root systems, reinforced with a rock system. And that's what the basic fundamental design reasoning behind all of these stream bank stabilization projects is typically a rock root matrix that is going to be stable, and it has to be designed a certain way in order to remain stable. So I think that hopefully that answers, or at least kind of addresses, some of the questions that were brought up. I'm going to look really close at the USGS study and really try to make it hand in glove fit with what we're doing. They've kind of created, here's what you could potentially do. Now it's kind of our job to figure out how do we get the storage in order to accomplish what it was that Dr. Leroy said the benefits that you could receive from getting that storage. So it's really cool. I think that's we have this opportunity to have the other half, I guess you would say, of a good study like this, to see how what we do should have some really positive long-term benefits on Cox Creek. And one last thing to say, those are systemic improvements. Every bit of storage and flow reduction we can do is going to provide some benefit all through the system downstream. That benefit reduces, though, as you go downstream. It's less and less benefit. So the middle part of the watershed will get the most benefit, where the triple meander bend is. But further downstream towards the Missouri River, you're going to get less of a benefit. So keep that in mind. Those are incremental, and they're going to take a long time to see benefits from those types of things because they're systemic, and it takes time for the creek to begin to heal. And so these little spot things that we do called stream stabilization projects, those are to put Band-Aids on the big gaping wounds and try to patch those up while the whole system as a whole begins to heal over the many years that it takes the things that we're doing to start to take effect and provide the benefits that you want to see. That's all probably very long-winded, but hopefully it's helpful, and I'm going to stop right now and take any questions that you might have.
Right, Ms. Edens.
A couple comments, and then I'm gonna make a motion, but I wanted to thank you and Dr. Leroy for staying on as well. The first thing I want to say is I really appreciate cost estimates. As the two of us are council members, this is the time where we start to put together budgets. This is the time where we've been in communication with our lobbyist for what we expect to try to ask for next general session. And so the more information that we have now, the better. I can't remember if Councilmember Farmer, if you were already on, or if this was when Councilmember Taylor was still on, but I just wanted to provide some background information. At first, I was really concerned about what the estimates were going to be, specifically in the Lake Chesterfield area, and I'm glad to see that it was a reasonable amount and reasonable fixes. A few years ago, we on council had a lot of engineering reports that we read as it related to the road and the earthen dam that it's on, because we own the road down to the core, and the subdivision and HOA owns what is essentially the side of the dam. And so at the time, the HOA's main concern was also aesthetic, because the lake was sold to them as a recreational item, not just a retention basin. And it was about beauty and being able to take a little boat out if you want and walk around it. And it's a karst rock formation, and there's been developer fixes and other fixes, and it just really doesn't hold the level of water that they're visually expecting the entire time. I read enough engineering reports to convince me that it would have to be lined, relined, lined in thoughts and prayers because of the karst rock formation for it to ever really hold the level that they want it to hold. And at the time, and I will say this, the council members have turned over to represent that area, and so have probably the HOA board members. But we asked them to come back, like, if you're willing to kick the money in to cover your aesthetic things, that's fine. But we're really concerned about structure. And there was, I guess, a lot of debate internally with the HOA meetings. They were never really able to come back to us with any solutions or an ask. So just keep that in mind if you do approach the HOA. I know you said you mentioned wanting to kind of change the easements or the areas kind of around with the slope, is that we were not able to make headway because the expectation was that aesthetically it would look how they wanted. And this job of this committee is to not ensure that a little boat can go on it. It's to ensure that the watershed is well managed and the rate is slowed. So I just wanted to, before you get in a can of worms, I just wanted to provide some feedback from 5 years ago. And really, when you talk to them, please manage expectations, because we don't have the money to do that. And as specific, when I was talking about buyouts, it was related to a city FEMA program. So like the house that you were talking about, I wouldn't really qualify for that. And that's also a different can of worms. But yeah, we've had a history of trying to work with them and failing. And again, at the time, our main concern was the integrity of the road, which we determined to be safe. And then the rate of which the water was entering and leaving, but not the aesthetic look beyond the capacity that it needed to have. Okay.
Sure.
So
and I will say those two things are not critical. They were kind of add-ons to make it a little better. So I appreciate you kind of giving me a heads up on that.
Yeah, it's a good luck. But $100,000 is if it makes a significant impact, that's a reasonable sell, and that's something I work with. At the time, the expectation was we want the whole lake relined and everything else, and we just couldn't go there. So the motion that I wanted to make, and I'm glad you already mentioned that you're willing to do this, but I just wanted to restate your intentions formally for the council, is for you to meet with staff and Dr. Leroy and come back with a proposal that includes those 3 additional areas as well, because again, it is budgeting time. I want you to pretend as if you didn't have to worry about the money. Please let Councilmember Farmer and I worry about the money. Give us your wish list and plans, because I have just come to the conclusion that I probably can't get a Storm and Parks sales tax passed, but I might be able to get bonding done, or I might be able to get other grants done. But I have to have a plan for it to ask. And if I can get this sooner, I can start making the case to the voters that we really need this and we haven't been spinning our wheels. So the motion is for you to come back with those 3 extra places and kind of your wish list and estimates. Of course, when it's convenient to you, but the sooner the better. So hopefully within the next, say no more than 3 months, but preferably 1 to 3.
Okay.
All right.
I will say, just from my experience of being a stormwater engineer here in Springfield for many years, and from what I can recall looking at your St. Louis County GIS system at the property lines, one of the tough factors maybe, and maybe you probably have a good feel for this, is that a lot of that land is not in control. It's not controlled by the city. It might be vacant land. It might be really good for a place to put some storage, but it's not. You'd have to get it, right? You have to get an easement or buy the land or something. So anyway, just a warning. It seems like everything might look really, really great. And then you realize, oh, but we don't have the land and we may or may not be able to get our hands on it. So anyway.
Right, right. I guess I'm just looking for more of an engineering estimate for the structure, and then if we'd have to buy an easement or
I'll leave
approach a
that.
developer
Then
property.
you
Yeah.
want me to
Yeah,
just leave
right.
that one to you, all right?
Or yeah, preferably staff.
Yeah, okay. Well, then I won't, well, I'll tell you whether or not it's city land or not, but I'll let you all worry about that. I'll just go forward as if you were able to get it. I do
Right,
have a
sweet.
question. We talked
Sure.
about possibly, I know we were saying we don't really want to touch Big Lakes Chesterfield because of the karst, but I don't see anything that would hurt to run a little routine that now that I have the model in place, it wouldn't be a big deal to just see what could be done to the bigger outlet structure there on the Big Lake Chesterfield. I think it's a 14-foot diameter overflow weir, if I remember right. But you know, is it even worth going there? I guess is my question to you all. Or is that just no? We've had it with Lake Chesterfield. We don't, with all the karst and everything. We're not even going to consider making any modifications there.
I think we're probably much better served focusing on some other items than the Big Lake Chesterfield for sure.
Okay.
So while I appreciate the
won't-
offer, I think
I don't
let's
want to. I
let's
don't
leave
want to
that one
spend any time on it.
untouched.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I don't wanna
All
waste my
right, so
Okay.
I have a couple questions too, but before we do that, we do have a motion on the floor. Anybody care to second Ms. Eden's motion? Yes, no, maybe so. All right, Mr. Delante seconds it. So this will be a motion to have Mr. Wagner check into basically the USGS proposed possible additions of extra reservoirs. 3 areas. All right. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Any abstentions? All right. So, Mr. Boone, you got that, Mr. Wagner? Please take a look
Yes.
at that stuff.
Okay.
Does anybody else have any questions before I get to mine?
Just a quick one.
Sure, Mr. Sturman.
And it's regarding the riprap, concreted riprap put on the walls, installed on the walls of the basins. And I assume it goes all the way from the bottom, all the way up to the top of the berm. And I'm sure that's standard, especially when it's a new one and you have bare soil that you got to cover. And it could be it's on a number of our existing ones. Right after our last meeting, though, I walked the West Glen one. We talked about it. And there it has a good stand of grass and vegetation to include some trees that are growing up where the sloped wall comes down to the bottom. And a lot of that will probably have to be cleaned out, I guess. But I wonder at a basin like that, that's got a good stand of grass and vegetation, and it appears to me that's been there a long time without movement or deterioration. And so I was just wondering if in a basin such as that, if a concrete riprap wall would be required.
Yeah, and I will say I'm sorry to play with these little terms, but it wouldn't have any concrete in it. It would just be loose rock. Grouted riprap's kind of a bad word, and we try to always avoid grouted riprap as we can because it almost always fails. But it would just be loose rock, just quarried stone, probably 6 to 9 inch diameter stone, nothing large. And the reasoning there was that's again a good point. You have good vegetation around the perimeter of the pond. And I would say, actually, I'd probably say it's fair. There's some erosion, particularly around the inlet and outlet structures. There's some of those trees, willows or whatever they were. They're not real great looking trees, and some of them were kind of halfway falling in a little bit. There was a little bit of erosion going on in places. And there's not a solid line of trees. A solid line of trees. A lot of it was grass. And so when that particular one, if you remember, we get a lot of benefit out of that one. And the reason we get so much benefit from it is because we're able to recoup so much of that storage. So whereas that pond now goes up and down a foot or two in a major rainfall event at most, now you're going to see it going up and down a foot or two or three all the time because it's going to be much more restricted. And so my concern is what I don't want to happen is I condone doing this project, and then 3 to 5 years down the road, you have these terrible erosion problems around your bank that you didn't ever used to have before. And now, now it's a big problem. I'd rather address the problem before it happens. And let's just say the water is going to be going up and down more. It's going to be going up higher. Let's just go ahead and clean out the vegetation and put in the rock on the bank. And that way we know that you're going to have a long-term, stable, satisfactory condition for the neighborhood to maintain. That was my reasoning for that.
Okay, that makes good sense. And thank you.
Well, as the president of that HOA, I appreciate that. That's nice. So I had a couple quick things. One is about the retention basin in Town Center, specifically the big one with all the trees and stuff in it. So we have been having a number of conversations over the last couple of years, and certainly currently, about some rather large scale developments going in basically right around that basin. So with that being said, does that change what you might suggest we do, or is there something we need to be figuring out, since obviously they haven't started building anything yet? And I'm not even sure what that would be at the moment anyways, but certainly there's a desire to put something there, and that something would be a lot of impervious surface, let's just say.
Yeah, I believe there was a development that Mr. Vunich supplied to me, and I guess it never got developed, but by looking at those plans, it was apparent that they were, I believe, trying to remember if that water was going to go to the basin, or perhaps it was going to not go to the basin, but that the basin was over-designed to account for that additional runoff. I'd have to go back and look at that as I make my final report. I will double check that and make sure that we account for any future development and how that future development would drain. And I have a plan. I believe I still have that plan. I could look at it and use that to make sure that I'm making my assumptions correctly, not just for today, but for the future, so that we don't restrict it and then later we find out, oh, there's more water coming, and now it's a problem. So I'll be sure and take a look at that.
Great. And then also, I too was really pleased at kind of what I would call the overall price point to fix or to do this, because it seems to be very much not too crazy, which is great. And while I certainly hope to be able to join Miss Edens in her ability to get a bunch of money from our colleagues, much like we asked Dr. Leroy, if there is one of these projects that seems to be the best bang for the buck, or whatever you want to call it, something that we can focus on, what would you suggest? Whichever one of these things it is, which would you suggest that be?
Well, I guess I would probably have to not answer that directly, but say that any of these by themselves isn't really going to help much. The key is to take as many of these 7 ponds as we can make improvements on. The more the merrier, the more good you're going to see. You can see the price point on those. It doesn't really vary that much from one to the other. So none of them jump out as, oh, this one's not worth it, versus, oh yeah, this one's the best bargain. I think they're all probably a bargain when you're looking at $2 or $3 million per shot on these big stream bank stabilization projects. So I would say let's do as many of these as we can, and look at the new assignment here to look at some additional spots. And I really feel like if you were able to do these, or at least most of this 7, the majority of them, the first 3 would probably be the most important that I listed here. But also, if you could add in another 2, 3, 4 other detention basins that wouldn't be too expensive to build in the upper reaches of the watershed, I think you'd really have something where you'd actually see what Dr. Leroy was showing was significant drops in shear stresses and velocities. And while that doesn't fix it overnight, that stops the bleeding and allows the creeks to start to heal. And that's you have to look at it that way. It's the best you can hope for, is just to stop the bleeding and start the healing. And maybe we can speed that up with some stitches, with a stream bank stabilization project here and there. But so I don't know. That probably doesn't answer directly, but that's what I think is the best way to answer that question.
That's actually exactly the answer I was hoping you were going to give me. So I appreciate that.
Okay.
Mr. Scher, I see you got your hand up on Zoom. Do you have a question for us?
Just actually a question and comment. So, Mr. Farmer, you were thinking exactly like I was about planned development around town center and how that might impact additional storage capacity. And so I think that's interesting, and I would just expand that. I'm not aware of any development, but I'm sure others sitting around the table are, and that any planned development definitely be considered for all these additional storage capacity projects.
Great.
That's
Mr.
my
Oaks.
comment. Oh, and I just had another comment. I love the word systemic improvements versus the Band-Aids or the stitches. And again, I'm not super knowledgeable in this, but I would just challenge yourselves to think of any other systemic improvements that might be lower cost, that might be out there, that might be more preventative in nature. And again, I don't know exactly what those are, but maybe some other folks around the table are more aware of those.
Something to think about. I know you all are about ready to embark on all of your watershed master planning and all your watersheds. Cox Creek, you probably know this, but I'll say it to reinforce it. Cox Creek has progressed for decades in a bad way, and unfortunately it's past the point that it can self-heal. With a lot of these things, it's going to need some help. Excuse me. But some of your other less developed areas, they still have hope of these systemic types of approaches, whether it's limits on where you develop, how you develop, stormwater controls, all those things, how you protect your riparian corridors. All those are systemic improvements that happen through planning. And you've got one of the best planning directors I've ever been around there. So I know you guys have done a good job, and hopefully can even figure out ways to do better with going forward with your master plan and how you want to approach the other watersheds that haven't gone downhill as far as Cox has, unfortunately.
Mr. Oaks.
I'll get this thing yet. You gave us reduced flows for each of the 4 projects you have in mind. Is it possible? I don't want you to do it right now on the fly, but in your final estimate or report, would you be able to tell us the increase in capacity that we would be getting?
Yeah.
What's the total impact on capacity?
I was thinking about an hour before the meeting, I was thinking, I should have had all the increases in volume available for you. It'll definitely be in the report, along with a lot of other information that I just don't have time to cover, and something you need to read and digest. But yes, that will be available in the report for sure.
Super. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
That was actually going to be part of my question as well, maybe as a follow-up, but I think it'd be really interesting to look at the overall added capacity proposed by the 3 additional basins, and compare that to what we would potentially be looking at adding with retrofitting. So that if, we were to say, hey, we can get to, 35% of the proposed added capacity by doing retrofitting, and then maybe we need to look at doing 2 detention basins rather than 3. But that might be an interesting exercise.
Yeah, and as all this, yes, I was thinking the same thing. So I will definitely have those. That'll be at the top of the list of information that y'all get, is looking at those volume comparisons.
All right. Anybody have anything else? Mr. Boone, did you got anything? All righty. Well, thank you, Mr. Wagner, for joining us this evening. We really appreciate it, and we're looking forward to the final plan.
Okay, thank you all. Good night.
Have a good evening. All right. Next up on the agenda, we've got our updates on projects.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair and members of the task force, the department just wants to briefly give you an update on 3 projects that have been underway through the guidance and direction of the task force members. First is the Stormwater Management Master Plan. As you know, during the spring and early summer, we spent a great deal of time interviewing 4 firms that ultimately had submitted the response to the request for qualifications. Ultimately, the task force recommended a team approach, with M3 Engineering and HR Green being the 2 that would team together to address a rather large area, 68 square miles, which is Wildwood, and 9 watersheds, in the context of the EPA template for the Stormwater Management Master Plan. I note that because that means we actually go beyond the boundaries of Wildwood itself, so even a larger area. On August 12th, Departments of Public Works and Planning met with the teams, that being HR Green and M3 Engineering, and we had a very good meeting. And we left that meeting with an acknowledgement that they could work together and accomplish this task as a team. We are expecting a proposal from the firms sometime in the beginning of October, so it coincides with our budget process. Mr. Newberry prepared a summary of the key points that were discussed at that meeting of the 2 consultants, and that's the context of the memorandum. Good news, Proposition S, which was proposed by the Metropolitan St. Louis Sewer District, passed in April of this year. What does that mean? About $30 million will be distributed between the municipalities and St. Louis County to address actual repairs to stormwater problems within the system of creeks and watersheds. That is a lot more money than they have ever had, and it'll be a lot more money coming our way than we've ever had. So good news there. Even better news in some regards, as you can see from the map that was provided by the Metropolitan St. Louis Sewer District, there are a number of projects that are proposed in the city of Wildwood. A couple of those coincide with our critical locations, one of which is Evergreen Forest Court. And I draw attention to that just because of the simple fact that we are in a position as the city to proceed forward in a much shorter time frame. And given the critical need of that and the threat that it poses to at least 1 or 2 home sites, the departments are engaging with Metropolitan St. Louis Sewer District to see if we could proceed forward with design, engineering, and construction at a quicker pace and be reimbursed, and thereby address what we believe is a serious situation. As soon as we get a response from the Metropolitan St. Louis Sewer District, we'll let you know. Mr. Berger, there's light at the end of the tunnel finally. Either it's us or MSD, but we're getting closer every day. And so those are the 3 updates, I think, of major importance. We are moving forward with our team of consultants. We hope to have a proposal from them here at the start of October, which is tomorrow. And then we'll get that back to the task force for review. And then ultimately we need to get it to city council so they can review it, make decisions regarding it, and then hopefully fund it for implementation in 2025. If there are any questions, department would be glad to respond.
The MSD thing, I saw a small graph of sites. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay. And are all of those in Wildwood?
yes, the list that was provided to the city are all Wildwood sites.
And who provided them?
My understanding from talking with one of the engineers is their participation on our task force for a couple of years. As you may, I think it preceded you, Mr. Delante, but we had a representative from MSD participate in the first couple of years of our task force meetings. They took away the critical locations and some of the other sites that had been identified. Additionally, one of the initial tasks of the task force was to basically throw a net out into the community and say, where do you have problems? Property owners. And we have a list of about 90 to 100. They are provided that list on a regular basis. And then finally, the complaints they receive from property owners. And so it's a multi-pronged approach.
So you as director of planning and so on, and the task force were somewhat involved in what was on that list. And in your mind, that little graph and that list, you're okay?
Actually, it doesn't address some of the, as I mentioned, there's an overlap, I think, of 2 of 6. So that means there's 4 critical locations that have been identified by the task force, endorsed by city council, that are minus or not on the list. I would probably argue we need to talk to them, do some lobbying, and see if we can get not only those 4 on the list, but a couple of others that I know are very problematic and impacting individual lots or groups of lots in a similar situation to Evergreen Forest.
So as far as you know, there's an avenue for you to do that?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Ms. Edens.
Yes, I think it's appropriate here, but I could also put it under other matters. But I wanted to kind of add 2 things back on the plate. Originally, we had talked about, paying for the triple meander work since we own it. And then I think we've all gotten beaten down by the budget and it's fallen off the list because we just didn't have any money to ask for it. So my concern is that we own it, we have to maintain it. Let's put it back on the list. And if nothing else, then it's that big project. It's listed on the strategic plan. We can ask for it in a bond. We can ask for it lobbying. We can get grants. I can find a money tree and a leprechaun in March. But I just, it's glaring to me that it's not on the list. I wish I would have asked Dr. Leroy to stay on the line. I just didn't want to go off the agenda. But one thing I would like us to consider, so we'll finish the report, have a closure, and then start a second report. And I would be interested in looking into Fox Creek more. The reason why we started with Fox Creek is because the experts that did the original evaluations of all 9 watersheds told us that was by far the worst with the erosion. And so that is why we have picked that piece of the pie to handle first. But that doesn't mean there aren't issues that are affecting public safety or property in different ways in other areas. They just don't have the same structural issues. Yeah. So what I would like is some data on where that flooding is projected to get worse, in the same way that we have collected data on the erosion. And that's really for a couple of reasons. One, it's for us to make the case that we need help in this area for funding, but it's also in how we plan our emergency responses and roads, right? So I'm sure you saw my email that it was requested that I help facilitate a meeting with Monarch because they're concerned about roads that are closed and flooding and emergency mass notifications. And by the way, they're the ones that do the water rescues for the entire area. So they are the unit that does that. So this data helps them, and there isn't anybody else to do it but the government, and MSD is not going to do it. So I would want to know how much that costs to add a study for flooding. I'm assuming it's just Fox Creek. I may not be correct about that. So and then I would like to get that on the budget as soon as possible for council. Just to start, if we can, this fiscal year, if there's any money, and if not, next year, because we're just not experts enough in that to make good decisions about what to do to mitigate. Yeah.
Tom, I saw you pop on there. Is there something you wanted to add?
Yeah, and been listening in, but just wanted to note that I think Fox Creek is going to be a very it's going to be one of the primary focuses amongst all the other all 9 watersheds within our master plan that we're going to be formulating. But in this case, and Mr. Bunish could maybe direct a little bit further on this, but I'm thinking maybe we could have, and I know we've had some discussions, Joe, that we would have quite a bit of focus on Fox Creek just from the start once we get those engineering firms out there and starting on the work. But we are putting, currently as we're budgeting, we are planning to put monies aside, obviously, to push forward that stormwater management master plan, in which we also do have money set aside this year to get started. So both looking good, and hopefully we can get things going this year. Great, thanks.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
Just a couple of points to Miss Edens. Over the course of time, we've been at this now 3+ years. One of the first things the department did with some of the consultants that were engaged early on is to identify necessarily a priority, but we have 9 watersheds. What are the 3 at greatest risk? And they came back Cox Creek, Fox Creek, and Bottom Creek. And those are the focus, I think, of the department in terms of identifying problem areas, getting them on the list so that they aren't forgotten as faces change and time passes. And certainly from visiting Dr. Rambo's property, visiting the property of the 2 speakers tonight, Fox Creek is surprisingly a problem because development really hasn't changed in that area. There's been additional homes added, but it's on a 1 by 1, maybe a couple a year. But we're just seeing what I would consider just a really stressed creek. And I don't know the reason why. That's why, as Mr. Farmer, our chair, mentioned, I think this stormwater management master plan, they give us some idea. What are the origins of that? I hope it's just not climate change and there's not much we can do. I hope there's something we can do.
And just to clarify, because in my mind, the information that Dr. Leroy and USGS would give us would be different than what the stormwater master plan would actually have. Are you saying that the information would be duplicated and we don't need an additional study?
Well, what I am saying is as you saw tonight with Dr. Leroy, they do analysis. They do not draw conclusions.
Right.
And so do we need another study to go into the creek and identify, for the most part, what I think we'll see in what we saw in Cox Creek, obstructions in the creek, changes in the banks, things along those lines. I think we're at a point in our knowledge base where we can move forward with the stormwater management master plan, which will actually be done by engineering firms and give us actual steps to address the problem.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking the template is from our USGS. They've told us what we should expect over the next 25 and 75 years for climate change. They've told us what they've saw in terms of the dynamics of the creek. And I think we can take that information, as Mr. Wagner mentioned, and incorporate it into our thoughts and our processes and get some actual steps forward. So
yeah, I understand your reasoning. I guess in my mind, she identified additional areas where we could add something and did the fluvial dynamic modeling, whereas that was not the assignment or scope or the way that Wilson Hydro thought or Wagner and Associates. So I see them working together, but not necessarily replacing each other, because she did bring in a new idea that they hadn't. And so I
very
just
much so
think it might be worth the cost of the study.
And so so the task force is aware, based upon your work, we now require individualized stormwater management facilities on any new project in the non-urban or the rural areas. If you build a home, we're requiring some type of stormwater management to minimize the amount of water runoff that comes from the site. And it can be a dry well, bioretention, amended soils. There's a litany of things that we offer, but they all have to do something now.
Yeah, I think the other thing to think about, Lauren, with that is like what we would be. The other thing that the master plan opens up for us, I can see you there too, Tom. You can hop in a second. The other thing the stormwater master plan opens up for us is the ability to get the federal grants. And so I think by the investments we've made to really kind of not just confirm what we already thought was going on, but to see that it is what we thought was bad is probably worse. We can apply that knowledge everywhere else. And so, I mean, I'm happy to have them study all they want, but I also think like we're maybe past the point of studying. Now we know we need to add retention in other places that we can. Hopefully what you said is correct, Mr. Booners, that it's not just, well, climate change and what are we going to do about it? You know, it may be worth looking outside of our borders in some of these watersheds and figuring out where this water is coming from, because there has been a substantial amount of development there too. So I'm all for getting as much information as we can, but I also want to work smart and fast on this thing because I don't love meetings all that much. I like to get things done. Tom, what you got?
Yeah, I was actually just going to echo that sentiment and just reemphasize just the fact that the funding for this for our master plan, it's kind of, we're going to get to a point where we have to pick and choose the priorities. And when it comes to the return on investment, hopefully with the master plan, and after speaking with the consultants and speaking with others in the field, that 9-element plan that they'll be submitting, that is going to really help push the button forward, if you will, on us potentially having more funding opportunities throughout all 9 watersheds. And in this case, just really more so, I think another study of Fox Creek would be, very beneficial. But I was only wanting to mention that if it comes down to, one or the other, I think we should probably forward our master plan as fast as we can so we can start applying, because I know there are timetables associated with how long they have to monitor the certain water levels and what kind of pollutants are in there. And those testing mechanisms have to be in place for a decent amount of time. So the sooner we can get them out in the field and studying it and engaging with the public, the better chance we're going to have of having that completed 9-element plan. And then obviously have that go along with potential consultants to help us with the EPA funding.
All right. Anybody have anything else? Okay. I just had one quick question, Joe. I don't know if you'll know the answer. So our Deerberg's pond that we're talking about, who is responsible for that?
Generally speaking, it's Greenberg Development. Now, our stormwater flows into it. Coleman Properties, which is Wildwood Town Center, the 15 acres, their stormwater flows into it. But ultimately, the responsible party, according to MSD, is Greenberg Development.
Okay.
And they did clean it out a couple of years ago, surprisingly, and most of the vegetation grew right back. So we'll start a discussion with Mr. Cohn and Mr. Greenberg and see what we can do to address that. Because Mr. Wagner identified something I hadn't necessarily thought of, and that's the root systems impacting the integrity of the retaining walls. So we need to address it.
Okay, excellent. All right. If nobody has anything else, our next meeting is yet to be determined. We do have budget stuff coming up, so we'll probably get through that. I would imagine it will probably be the beginning of next year. You think it'll be sooner than that? Sooner than that. All right. So sooner than that. So Thanksgiving and Christmas time, we'll all be seeing each other again, hopefully. Yes, ma'am.
You recognizing me, Mr. Chair?
Absolutely. Yeah. What?
Oh, I was just going to mention just something that it was in my report. Only the council members on the board here, task force saw it, but just wanted to make a quick mention of it because I do believe it's pertinent. I think the city could provide quite a bit of insight on it. Open Space STL actually has already received a 319 grant for Hamilton Car Creek, along with some other areas, and the city is going to allow them to use our meeting facility space here in City Hall. That is going to take place on Wednesday, November 6th. from 2:30 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. All members of the task force, council members, the mayor, city staff, they're all welcome to attend. It's a kickoff meeting to really focus in on, well, specifically with Hamilton Creek, it's, we're kind of at the mouth of it, but they're going to be focusing on some of the pollutants that are in Hamilton Creek and cleaning that up, but also looking at some of the stormwater implications as well. So in this case, it may be beneficial just to see, even if they're going to be doing their thing and getting this done, but it might be interesting to also meet with them just to talk about how they got that grant and to learn more about that process, just because I do know it's a pretty strenuous one after speaking with the woman that works with open space. So just wanted to remind everybody, I can send out an email to the task force if you'd all like, but it's Wednesday, November 6th, 2024 from 2:30 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. And the Missouri Department of Natural Resources will be kind of guiding that meeting along with the open space STL.
All right, great. Mr. Bunich.
Couple of things. If you're wondering, why wasn't the task force told about this study? Because the city wasn't told about this study. So it was all done without notification of anybody at Wildwood City Hall. And then secondly, the reason I think we'll need another meeting before the end of the year is if we get the consultant proposal for the stormwater management master plan, we always take it to the task force members for a recommendation before we forward it on to city council. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Anybody have any other questions or anything else? All right. Well, with that, I will take a motion to adjourn if anybody wants to get out of here. Ms. Edens makes the motion. Anybody care to second? Mr. Sturman seconds it. All those in favor of adjourning this evening, please say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? Any abstentions? All right.